Some thoughts on Acts in chapter 7 and verses 1 through to 19. The key figure here is Stephen. Let's think about Stephen as he is described in Acts in chapter 6. There's two verses which refer to his character. Firstly, in Acts in chapter 6 and verse 5, we read that Stephen is a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. Then in verse 8 we read that he is full of grace and power. We would observe then that Stephen is a godly man. He's a man for God. He's a man who is exhibiting the characteristics of somebody who is a follower of God. But accusations are made against him by the ruling establishment. So in verse 11, we read them saying in chapter 6, verse 11, that he speaks blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And then in verse 13, we read that these false witnesses who say that Stephen never ceases to speak words against the holy place and the law. So three things that he is accused of speaking against: God, the law, and the worship centre. God, the law, and the worship centre. So as we come into chapter 7, we're coming to Stephen's defence. His declaration that the true faith is the faith that comes out of the Old Testament into Jesus Christ and on into his church. It is not with the religious establishment, it is with the Christ church. In doing this, he goes back to the solid foundations of the Old Testament workings of God. In these opening verses, there are two individuals concentrated upon: Abraham and Joseph, key figures in the beginnings of the nation of Israel. We will notice, first of all, as he comes to speak to them, responding to the request of the high priest, in verse 1, he speaks to them, brothers and fathers. We notice a courtesy here. There's something good to be aware of here as regards to being courteous to people. He's not abrupt. He, as it were, binds with them. Now, as we come to Abraham, there's an emphasis here on the connection with the God who is the true God, the God of glory. Stephen is saying, I'm with this one. I want to declare this one. I want to show how this one worked with Abraham. He called him out of Ur of the Chaldees. Look about all of the workings of God. God of glory appeared. There we read in verse 2. And in verse 3 we read, and said to him. And then in verse 4 we'll read, God removed him. Then in verse 5 we'll read, yet he gave him. And then in verse 5, but he promised to give it to him. Verse 6, and God spoke. Verse 8, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. So all of these things are an indication of God working with Abraham, establishing that solidly and firmly, and he's setting out the purpose about what would happen. Verse 6 there, notice, and God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. Then he's going to go on to Joseph and see how that was outworked, and ultimately how the people of God were brought out of Egypt. God is working. God is with Abraham. The foundation is connected back into by Stephen. It's so important for us to note. Verse 8 will tell us of the covenant of circumcision, the sign of God's commitment to them. And they declare their commitment to him with the cut of the flesh. So we establish it is with Abraham, and it is with Isaac, and it is Jacob, and the 12 patriarchs, as we there read in verse 8. So we come into verse 9, and we come on to Joseph, and we see with Joseph, God was with him. This similar theme, God was working in Joseph's situation. and he took him down into Egypt. And then God works to take the people of Israel, Abraham, and the family down into Egypt, all part of God's plan, which is stated there in verse 6. And they gather in Egypt. Verse 15, Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they're brought back and buried in Shechem. And God has got his hand upon all this. And so in verse 7, the time is drawing near, the time of the promise. Will it come to pass that after 400 years they'll be brought out? Of course it will. God is working it all out. And a king arises who did not know Joseph. And then we see the raising up of Moses. Thus far, you would say that the people who were listening to Stephen were very likely on his side. It soon changes, though, but that's just a reminder as well. We don't unnecessarily cause problems with people. We bind with them appropriately from the word. So the exciting story goes on that the new regime, the church regime, the Christ people regime, are the people of God connected with Abraham, Joseph, and onward. And we will continue to look at that in a further study, God willing. So that's some thoughts on Acts chapter 7, verses 1 through to 19.